Martell Holt had finally calmed down. Something new brought it all back into focus. This time, it wasn't old cheating rumors or past mistakes, but a recent statement that sparked fresh controversy. Martell referred to Arionne as nothing more than a temporary replacement, and that instantly got people talking again. Because this wasn't about a small fling or a passing moment, it involved a woman who had been in his life for years, shared a serious relationship with him, and even had a child with him. So when she was described in such a dismissive way, people started questioning how someone can go from being such an important part of your life to just being labeled temporary. Not long ago, the story looked very different. There was passion, secrecy, and a relationship that seemed strong enough to shake a marriage. But now, the way it's being described makes it sound like it never really mattered at all. And that's where the confusion begins. When people start rewriting their own history, it often looks like an attempt to control the narrative and shape public perception. To understand how things reached this point, you have to go back. Martell Holt was once part of what many saw as a powerful couple. On the surface, his marriage with Melody looked solid, built on success, family, and shared goals. Together, they weren't just husband and wife, they were business partners and parents building a life many admired. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming slowly over time. Small issues, emotional distance, and growing disconnect eventually turned into bigger problems that weakened the relationship. That's when Arionne entered the picture. At first, everything was hidden and private, something the public knew nothing about. But what started in secret eventually grew into a long-term affair. It wasn't a brief mistake, it lasted years, involved emotional connection, trips, gifts, and ongoing involvement while Martell was still married. That's what made it so painful for many people to understand. It wasn't just betrayal, it was prolonged betrayal that slowly broke trust. When Melody found out, everything changed. Instead of reacting with public chaos, she handled it with calmness and distance. She chose to step back, focus on her children, and rebuild her life. That silence wasn't weakness, it was strength, showing control and self-respect in a difficult situation. Meanwhile, Martell's connection with Arionne didn't disappear immediately, which left many people confused. If it was just a mistake, why did it last so long? If it didn't matter, why was it so emotionally involved? Now, years later, the story has shifted again, and the same woman is being referred to as something temporary, a lesson, or a mistake. That sudden change in narrative is what has people questioning everything. If she was truly temporary, why did the relationship last for years? Why was there emotional attachment, and why was a child brought into the situation? These are the questions that keep resurfacing. At the same time, Arionne has remained mostly silent, which adds another layer of curiosity. Her silence leaves space for speculation, making people wonder whether she's choosing peace or simply waiting for the right time to speak. On the other side, Melody has continued moving forward with her life, focusing on growth, stability, and her children without getting pulled back into public drama. That steady progress has earned her respect from many who see her strength in how she handled everything. But at the center of all this are real consequences. These aren't just headlines or online debates. There are children, families, and emotional damage tied to every decision and every word spoken. When Martell makes statements like calling someone temporary, it doesn't just affect how people view that person, it also reshapes how his entire past is seen. And that's why this moment has created so much discussion. Some believe it's about image control, trying to distance himself from past decisions, while others think it reflects regret, the kind that comes only after everything has already fallen apart. But regret doesn't erase history. It doesn't undo pain or rebuild broken trust. It only changes perspective, and sometimes that change comes too late. The more the story shifts, the more questions people have. Was it real love or just a mistake? Was it something meaningful or just convenience? And why does the narrative keep changing now? In the end, this isn't just about relationships falling apart. It's about how people choose to tell their story afterward. Some reflect, some rewrite, and some stay silent. But the truth usually sits somewhere in between, unaffected by how it's presented. And that's why people are still watching closely, because no matter how many versions of the story are told, they're still searching for what actually happened. So the question remains, was that statement honesty or just another attempt to reshape the past? And as the conversation keeps growing, it becomes clear that this situation isn't just about one comment or one relationship anymore. It has turned into a wider discussion about accountability, timing, and how people deal with the consequences of their choices once the public is watching. Every new statement adds another layer, and every silence adds even more questions. For Martell, the challenge now is that words from the past and present don't easily align. When earlier actions showed one version of events and current statements suggest another, people naturally start comparing and questioning what's real and what's being reframed. That gap between what happened and how it's now being described is exactly what keeps the debate alive. For Arionne, the silence continues to speak in its own way. In situations like this, not responding can be interpreted in many different ways, as strength, as strategy, or as a decision to stay away from public conflict entirely. But silence also allows the public to fill in the blanks, and those gaps often get filled with assumptions rather than facts. And for Melody, her role in this story has already shifted. She's no longer at the center of the chaos, but instead positioned as someone who moved through it and chose stability over ongoing conflict. That's part of why her actions are often viewed differently, not because the past didn't affect her, but because of how she chose to respond to it. What makes all of this more complicated is how quickly narratives change in the public eye. One moment someone is viewed one way, and the next moment a single statement can shift perception completely. But even with shifting narratives, people tend to hold on to consistency, and when they see contradictions, they start digging deeper instead of moving on. That's why this situation keeps resurfacing. It's not just about what was said today, but how it connects to everything that was said and done before. And as long as those pieces don't fully line up, the discussion isn't going anywhere. At this point, it feels less like a closed chapter and more like an ongoing story that still hasn't reached its final explanation. People are still trying to understand motivations, timelines, and emotions behind it all, because from the outside looking in, it's not fully clear where truth ends and narrative begins. And maybe that's why it continues to stay relevant, because unanswered questions always keep people listening. And as the story continues to circulate, one thing becomes even clearer: public perception moves fast, but consequences move slowly. What might sound like a simple comment in the moment can reopen years of history, especially when people feel like the full truth has never really been settled in the first place. For Martell, that means every new statement is no longer taken at face value. Instead, it gets measured against everything that came before it. People don't just hear what he says now, they compare it to what they remember from interviews, past explanations, and the timeline of events that already played out in public. That's why this temporary replacement comment didn't land quietly. It connected directly back to a history that people are still trying to make sense of. For Arionne, the situation becomes even more complicated because silence in a high-profile situation doesn't stop the conversation, it just changes its direction. When one side speaks and the other doesn't, the narrative tends to grow on its own. People fill in gaps, create interpretations, and build assumptions around what isn't being said. And once that happens, the original story and the public version of it can start to look very different. Melody's presence in all of this remains different from the rest. Even without actively engaging in the ongoing discussion, she represents the aftermath, what life looks like after the headlines fade, but the impact remains. Her focus on stability and moving forward becomes part of why many people contrast her response with the ongoing back and forth around the past. It's not about who is right or wrong in the public debate, but about how differently people choose to carry what they've been through. As time passes, situations like this often shift from being about specific events to something larger: reputation, accountability, and how stories evolve when multiple versions exist at once. And once that happens, the facts, emotions, and interpretations all start blending together in the public space, making it harder to separate what was felt from what was actually said or done. That's why this story hasn't really settled. It keeps returning because there are still gaps in explanation, gaps in understanding, and gaps in closure. And as long as those gaps exist, people will keep revisiting it, trying to connect the pieces in a way that finally makes sense. But in reality, not every story gets a clean ending. Some stay open-ended, shaped as much by perspective as by facts. And this one, clearly, is still being written not just by the people involved, but by everyone watching from the outside trying to interpret what it all really means. And as the conversation keeps unfolding, it becomes even more clear that situations like this don't stay confined to the people directly involved. Once a story reaches a certain level of public attention, it stops being just personal history and starts becoming public interpretation. Every detail gets picked apart, every old clip gets replayed, and every new comment is weighed against everything that came before it. For Martell, that means there's no real separation anymore between past actions and present statements. Even if intentions change over time, public memory doesn't reset. People remember the timeline, the emotions, and the contradictions, and they use all of that as context for anything new that's said. That's why even a single phrase can reopen an entire discussion that seemed settled. For Arionne, the silence continues to act like a mirror, reflecting whatever people project onto it. Without a clear response, the story around her gets shaped more by outside voices than her own. That creates a situation where perception can sometimes become louder than reality, simply because there's nothing directly countering it. And for Melody, her continued distance from the ongoing noise reinforces a different kind of narrative, one centered around rebuilding rather than revisiting. While the conversation around her past remains active in public spaces, her actual life appears to be moving in a different direction, focused less on explanation and more on progression. What makes all of this so persistent is that there's no single version of events everyone agrees on. Instead, there are overlapping perspectives, emotional interpretations, and incomplete understandings all existing at the same time. And when that happens, the story doesn't really end. It just keeps evolving depending on who is telling it and when. At this point, the situation has moved far beyond one statement or one moment. It has become a larger reflection of how public narratives are built, how they shift, and how difficult they are to fully control once they leave the source. And as long as there are unanswered questions and different versions of the truth still circulating, people will continue trying to piece it together in their own way. Because in the end, stories like this don't really disappear, they just change form over time, shaped by memory, emotion, and interpretation rather than closure. And as this situation continues to evolve, it becomes clear that the biggest shift isn't just in what was said, but in how people are processing it. Over time, audiences become more aware that public stories are rarely complete, and what they see is often only fragments of a much larger reality. That's why every new detail gets so much attention, because people are still trying to connect missing pieces that were never fully explained in the first place. For Martell, this means the spotlight isn't just on one comment anymore. It's on the pattern people believe they see behind it. Whether fair or not, once a narrative forms in the public mind, every new statement gets filtered through that lens. That's why even attempts to redefine or clarify the past can sometimes create even more debate instead of closing it. For Arionne, the ongoing silence continues to leave room for interpretation, and in the absence of direct clarity, the public fills that space with its own conclusions. Some see that silence as intentional distance, others see it as unfinished business, but either way, it keeps her tied to the conversation without her actively participating in it. And for Melody, the contrast remains noticeable. While the discussion around the past continues to circulate, her present appears focused on stability and forward movement. That separation between public narrative and personal direction is part of why her response is often viewed differently. It represents moving forward without needing to continuously revisit what's already happened. As the conversation stretches on, it becomes less about specific events and more about how stories are remembered, reshaped, and retold over time. Each retelling adds a new layer, sometimes clarifying, sometimes complicating, but rarely leaving things exactly where they were before. And that's where the situation ultimately sits now, in a space where certainty is still missing, perspectives continue to clash, and the full picture remains just out of reach. As long as that remains the case, the discussion will keep returning, shaped by curiosity, unanswered questions, and the human need to make sense of something that still doesn't fully add up. And as the conversation continues to grow, one thing becomes more obvious. This isn't just about one moment or one statement anymore, but about how quickly narratives can evolve once they enter public space. What starts as a personal situation slowly turns into a widely discussed storyline, shaped by opinions, interpretations, and fragments of information that don't always form a complete picture. For Martell, that means every new comment now carries the weight of everything that came before it. Even if the intention is to clarify or move forward, the public response is rarely based on the present alone. Instead, it's filtered through memory, past events, and unresolved questions. That's why certain phrases or descriptions don't just stay in the moment, they reopen conversations that people thought were already settled.